Okay, good, happy Monday, Year 12. We're getting into our remote learning lesson 14. We're on week 10 of this process, and we have transitioned, we've bridged that gap between social diversity and gender diversity. So this week we're looking to establish knowledge and understanding of the bigger concepts relating to gender, some of which were already alluded to and introduced in the two articles that we were looking at last week as our springboard platform from social diversity to gender. Okay, so really, we've always got to think as we approach these topics in forms of questions, because that's how the exam works. It will pose questions. So last week we were using this question: to what extent does gender determine a person's use of language? But actually that question could be presented in a variety of different ways. However, the theme will remain the same, the key concepts will remain the same. So, for example, they might ask a question: how do women use language differently to men? Evaluate whether there is a difference in the way men and women use language. What attitudes are linked to women and men's uses of language? So, although we're looking at an umbrella term of gender, the reality is it could be presented in different question formats in the future. So when we move forward and we're beginning to introduce theory and concepts, we'll always try and link it back to a question format, okay? So we're going to keep using this primary yellow question here: to what extent does gender determine a person's use of language? But I just wanted to make you aware that potentially in the future, the questions can vary and have a slightly different focus. They can use the word women, men, gender, but really they're asking the same thing. Gender diversity: what extent does gender, a person's male or female kind of identification, determine their use of language? And the simple answer is always going to be yes, to some extent, because, but. Okay, so in response to any of these questions, we want to be able to say yes, to some extent, women do use language differently to men because, but. Yes, to some extent, there is a difference in the way men and women use language because, but. And yes, to some extent, there are different attitudes, such as blah, 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 linked to women and men's use of language because, but. So actually, our simple answer format has always got to be to have a knowledge of understanding concepts that enable us to say yes, and to illustrate that, to give reasons why. That's where that connective because comes in. The but, however, we recognise, we've seen this before with the mark scheme, is always about accessing the higher mark scheme. It's that line of challenge, evaluation. So yes, because, but. However, as it says there, that's the simple answer. As we see in this journey, it's a bit more complex than that. So what I would like us to do now is just to link back to our prior reading. Okay, now the first two bits have been completed for you. Okay, and I'm going to talk you through the but column, but then I'm just going to ask you to pause and to come up with your own counter arguments. Now, this is only the link to the prior reading to text A, so all of these ideas again reiterate, zoom back into that text A from the female article and some of the attitudes there. Okay, so as you can see, we've got women use language because, but. Now, again, this is women's use of language, and the because is all lifted from that article. So the but reminds us that even when we're analysing articles in the exam, we are positioned to have a but moment. Say, that's what this opinion is. This is what this writer is saying, but actually we could challenge it in this way. Okay, so according to that article, women use language to talk like 12-year-old girls. Women use language by catching it like a virus. Women use language in a way that mocks others. Women use language to emulate who they watch on the television. Women use language like vocal fry and uptalk, where you pronounce statements like questions, which are speech patterns of pronunciation. Women use language in the right way if they sound sexy and sophisticated. Women use language such as like as a filler. Women use language like power tools to build relationships. So all of those ideas, okay, actually are answering that question: to what extent does gender determine a person's use of language? However, it's all focused on a woman's use of language. So to what extent does the female gender, or does your female gender determine your use of language? Well, this article is consistently saying, well, yes, it does, because women do this, this, and this. Okay, so we saw that in the article. Now, with the because and the buts, it's up to you. You can either take one row at a time and pause me as I go, or you can just listen and then pause me and complete the activity. Okay, so women use language to talk like 12-year-old girls because it may placate men. So I've taken that reasoning from the article, from the bigger context of the article, where women were heard using talking like 12-year-old girls using this vocal fry to placate men. So that's because that's the reason according to the article. Okay, so in some people's opinions, to some extent, in the opinions of certain people, women use language to talk like 12-year-old girls because it may placate men. So I'm actually developing a line of reasoning. Yep, to a certain extent, women's will talk like 12-year-old girls to placate men. But, so what could a but moment be? Now, there's a little clue here, but this is a something judgment. Okay? Now, we're talking about how things sound, and we're talking about having an opinion about how people sound and come across without any real factual evidence. Now, there's two words that we use that are very similar in meaning, that are a really kind of sophisticated way to talk about these kind of judgments. Can you remember what it is? Brilliant. If you said aesthetic and arbitrary, spot on. Okay, women use language to talk like 12-year-old girls because it may placate men. But this is an arbitrary and aesthetic judgment being made where people's speech is being judged at the level of the superficial level, aesthetically, whether they like it. This is an arbitrary judgment because you're not really valuing the language, the what is being said, but you're valuing how. So a really good choice of words though, but this is an arbitrary and aesthetic judgment. Okay, so women use language by catching it like a virus because language is fashionable and passes on like a trend. But A challenges this idea of language being like an infectious disease. So here, who's the A? Now I'm giving you a little clue. Who is the A who came up with theories that challenge the idea of language being like an infectious disease, a damp spoon? So you could create a line of argument here by linking to a theorist. Who was that theorist? Can you remember? Beginning with A? Brilliant, Aitchison. So women use language by catching it like a virus, because language is fashionable and passes on like a trend. But Aitchison challenges this idea of language being like an infectious disease, and you could even take that further. Well, how does she challenge it? She says people only don't catch language, they adapt and adopt it if they want to. Also, the image of a virus suggests something degenerative, that something's negative, but actually language that is adapted and used by people tends to meet their needs, and those needs tend to be pretty complex. Okay, so women use language in a way that others mock because they are seen as markers of immaturity and stupidity. But this is an interpretation which can be open to. So what's wrong when people are saying that when women speak this way, we're going to mock them, we're going to call them immature and stupid? How can we challenge that interpretation? How can we say, oi, saying all women are immature and stupid when they speak this way is stupid because, so complete that one. Women use language to emulate who they watch on the television because vocal fry is used by people like the Kardashians and Valley Girls. But not only women do this, may also do it. So can you think of any other groups that might be influenced by the media and what they see on television to create a counter challenge there? Okay, women use language like vocal fry and uptalk, which is speech patterns of pronunciation, because they want to sound less threatening or domineering. Now, again, that was another idea from the article, that women are speaking this way because they want to sound less threatening or domineering. How could you complete this? But this could be, so what ideas could you come up with that one? How could you challenge that line of discussion? Women use language in the right way if they sound sexy and sophisticated, because they don't want to sound submissive to men. Now, this is something in that article that we didn't dwell on too much, but the writer, or the actress, sorry, Lake Bell, does make this interesting distinction. She said there's the sexy, sophisticated women, and there's the baby talkers. So she's still actually reducing the language of women to this sexy, sophisticated realm. And she's saying it's okay, it's right if women sound sexy and sophisticated, but we definitely don't want them to sound babyish, because then they sound submissive to men. But sexy and sophisticated, is that all women's talk is good for as well? So on this, but this is, you say, but this is still a stereotypical idea, but this is still reinforcing the idea that women are objectified and only valued on whether they're sexy or not. So you could still unpack that argument. Okay, women use language such as like as a filler because they are hesitant and unsure of what to say. So some people interpret fillers, likes, as being hesitant and unsure of what to say, but fillers can be used as a way to soften and hedge speech. So actually, I've done that one for you, just to remind you that we are going to be linking back to prior learning. We've looked at fillers before. Now, fillers, not always about being hesitant and unsure. They can be about hedging speech, softening what they say, making speech less threatening. Okay, women use language like power tools to build relationships because they are in control of how they are using language and its effects. So actually, this is the article. Remember, it ends with a positive, with that professor saying the truth is this. So this is a positive interpretation of a woman's use of language. They're building relationships as a power tool. But not everyone shares this view because. So guys, what I want you to do now is to definitely copy and complete that but element of the table. Now, if you've got a way to do this online, obviously having the whole table shows you the train of thoughts, but I just want you to do it for yourself to come up with your but challenges, your but statements and sentences there. Copy and complete them as our starter. Okay, that's going to get us linking back to our prior reading, but also beginning to think about some of these attitudes towards gender. Okay, so just pause now and take as long as you need. Okay, so this is introducing something new that we haven't done this side of remote learning, but it is something we began to do in class just before we broke up. Okay, so we began to introduce some key concepts that help us understand the relationship between gender, a person's use of language. Now, often, as we've seen with social diversity, there's the difference between the what of the language and the attitudes towards it. So we might say, what features of language is a woman using? Vocal fry. The problem arises when people begin to interpret and attribute to vocal fry a wrong or negative attitude, which we were beginning to see in those articles. You know, the appropriation of an attitude that says vocal fry is immature and stupid. So the problem with any investigation or analysis or understanding of the relationship between a person's use of language and who they are or how they categorize themselves is often influenced by the attitudes of others around them. Yeah, with that extrinsic motivation, we are often affected by the attitudes around us. So, in the area of gender, now these are 4 key concepts. We definitely want to know these areas, okay? So, again, in a minute, I'm going to ask you to pause and to copy these down really clear. Also, in terms of revision, these are definitely 4 key ideas that you need to know. Okay, so I'm going to go wah, wah. This is really important. So when we look at attitudes towards gender, we cover 4 Ds. We begin chronologically with the D of deficit. Now, this relates to an attitude towards women's language, which says that women's language is in a state of deficit. It fails or suffers from certain shortcomings in comparison to the language of men. So women who, when we talk about the deficit model, it's this model that interprets women's language usage as failing or suffering from shortcomings. Now, this is the oldest idea we look at. We're going to go back to the 1970s, and yet we see traces of this in the modern article from Female. Yet that women using vocal fry are somehow failing or suffering from shortcomings in their language. Yeah, so we see that although this is historically the oldest idea, the remnants of it are still resonant with modern attitudes today. Okay, the D of difference. Okay, so it seems quite simple here. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's a recognition and acknowledgement that women and men use language differently. Now, it overlaps with deficit because deficit is about saying that women use language differently, but they interpret it immediately from the negative standpoint of women somehow failing or suffering from shortcomings in their language. Whereas difference model tends to be seemingly initially more neutral, that men and women are different. Women do things this way, men do things this way. Okay, there is the D of dominance, the dominance model. Now, the dominance model supports and promotes the attitude that men use language to maintain power, that their language is about an assertion of dominance, of presenting themselves as dominant, okay, and therefore over women at this stage. Now, the 4th and the most modern idea is that really that this is a mythology, that difference, deficit, that these ideas really occupy the place of a mythology, that men and women really use language in very similar ways. But we focus on and we amplify and magnify the differences because it suits a social kind of idea and stereotype. We like to think that men and women are different rather than the same. So guys, these 4 Ds are really important. So just pause there and write down those definitions, okay, so that you've got them really clear.